For more than a decade, Vladimir Putin presented Crimea as proof that Russia could change the map of Europe and make the result permanent. The peninsula was more than territory. It was a symbol, a naval fortress, a military launch pad, a tourist destination, and perhaps most importantly, one of the most visible political trophies of Putin's rule. But something extraordinary is now happening. Crimea has not been conquered. Russian troops have not suddenly abandoned it. The Russian flag has not disappeared from Sevastopol. Yet the system that makes Russian control of Crimea possible is being attacked piece by piece. Electricity, fuel, railways, bridges, air defenses, communications, ports, supply routes. Ukraine is no longer trying simply to destroy individual military targets on the peninsula. Its strategy appears much larger. Make Crimea increasingly expensive to defend, increasingly difficult to supply, increasingly unreliable as a military base, and eventually increasingly uncomfortable for Moscow to hold. Ukraine's drone commander Major Robert Brovdy has now publicly described the recent attacks as only the first phase of a longer campaign designed to make Crimea unusable as a staging ground for Russian forces. Ukrainian strikes have already targeted railway bridges, oil facilities, electrical infrastructure, and Russian air defense systems. And that changes the entire meaning of what is happening. Because the battle for Crimea is no longer only being fought over territory, it is being fought over whether the territory can function. This is the real story behind what could be called the Crimean switch-off. And once you understand the strategy, Putin's crown jewel begins to look very different. Start with electricity. Normally, discussions about warfare focus on tanks, missiles, aircraft, and soldiers. But a modern military fortress depends on something far less dramatic. Power. Radar installations need electricity. Communication centers need electricity. Railway infrastructure needs electricity. Fuel pumps need electricity. Repair facilities need electricity. Command posts need electricity. Water pumping stations need electricity. Ports need electricity. And although military bases can switch to generators, those generators create another problem. They need fuel. That means every electrical failure creates additional pressure somewhere else in the logistics network. Ukraine appears to understand this perfectly. Rather than treating Crimea's power grid as an isolated target, Kiev is attacking it as part of a much larger military system. Ukraine's drone commander told the Associated Press that much of Russia's older air defense equipment depends on the electrical grid. His argument is straightforward: damage the electricity network, degrade the systems protecting Russian positions, and create openings through which additional drones can penetrate. He acknowledged that these attacks also disrupt civilian electricity supplies. That is exactly what has increasingly been happening. During July, blackouts spread through numerous areas of Crimea. Russian-controlled energy supplier CRIMEA acknowledged that populated areas had lost electricity, while Russian-installed authorities opened emergency centers where residents could charge phones and access basic communications. Reports from the peninsula described water pumps failing and public transportation being interrupted when electricity disappeared. Then came one of the strangest symbols of the entire crisis: public street telephones. In 2026, Reuters journalists in Yevpatoria documented newly installed street phones designed to allow residents to contact police and ambulance services when mobile networks fail. Think about what that means. This is territory Moscow has spent years portraying as securely integrated into modern Russia. Yet residents are once again being given fixed public telephones because electricity and communications can no longer be assumed to work reliably during attacks. Reuters also confirmed that Crimea has experienced both power outages and fuel shortages, while children's summer camps have been canceled and working hours for public transport and cafes have been reduced. But electricity is only the first layer. The second is fuel. And fuel may be even more important. A modern army consumes enormous quantities of it. Trucks need diesel. Armored vehicles need fuel. Generators need fuel. Aircraft require aviation fuel. Civilian transportation competes with military transportation for available supplies, and Crimea has a fundamental geographic problem. It is a peninsula. Almost everything that keeps a large military presence functioning must either be produced locally or brought in through a limited number of transportation corridors. That makes logistics vulnerable. Ukraine does not necessarily need to destroy every Russian truck traveling toward Crimea. It needs to make moving that truck slower, more dangerous, and more expensive. The same applies to fuel tankers, railways, ships, storage depots, and bridges. By July, the pressure had become severe enough that Russian authorities suspended gasoline sales to civilians in Crimea in an attempt to preserve supplies. AP reported that Ukrainian attacks had intensified against both supply routes and the electrical grid, while the Russian government considered additional restrictions on fuel exports as shortages affected wider Russian territory as well. Now consider what happens when the power campaign and fuel campaign begin reinforcing one another. A substation is damaged. Military equipment switches to generators. Those generators consume additional fuel. Fuel becomes harder to deliver because Ukrainian drones are targeting supply chains. More tanker trucks are required. More transportation capacity is required. More roads must remain open. More convoys need protection. More air defense systems are needed. Every solution creates another vulnerability. That is the logic behind the campaign. It is not necessary to completely destroy Crimea's infrastructure. Ukraine only needs to keep creating problems faster than Russia can cheaply solve them. And this brings us to transportation. Crimea depends on several major routes connecting it with Russian-controlled territory. The most famous is the Kerch Bridge. Since opening in 2018, the bridge has carried enormous symbolic importance for Putin. It physically connected Crimea with Russia. Its construction told Russians that annexation was permanent, but Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated that infrastructure once considered untouchable can be reached. Meanwhile, another crucial route runs through Russian-occupied southern Ukraine. Instead of focusing only on the spectacular target everyone recognizes, Ukrainian forces have increasingly attacked the wider transportation network, rail bridges, road infrastructure, fuel carriers, warehouses, and logistics nodes. In early July, the Institute for the Study of War assessed that Ukraine's intermediate range strike campaign against air defenses, petroleum transportation, logistics infrastructure, and electrical substations was severely disrupting Russian logistics in occupied Crimea. Ukrainian forces reported attacks on vessels transporting gasoline and dozens of electrical facilities during the opening week of July. Then Ukraine struck railway infrastructure. AP reported that Ukrainian forces said they attacked a railway bridge near Rozdolny, along with an oil storage facility at the Kerch thermal power plant, an electrical substation, and a liquefied natural gas distribution facility in Simferopol. The railway bridge was described by Ukraine as part of an important logistics route supporting Russian forces in southern Ukraine. Those battlefield claims could not all be independently verified. But that caveat actually highlights something important. We do not need to accept every Ukrainian destruction claim to see the broader pattern. Independent reporting confirms the outages. Independent reporting confirms fuel shortages. Independent reporting confirms emergency communications measures. Independent reporting confirms Ukrainian attacks on supply routes, military facilities, and power infrastructure. The direction of travel is clear, even when the precise damage from individual strikes remains disputed. And that direction becomes even more significant when air defense enters the picture. Crimea was once among the most heavily defended pieces of territory Russia controlled. Radar stations, electronic warfare, surface-to-air missiles, naval defenses, military aviation. For Ukraine's earlier generation of drones, penetrating this defensive umbrella was extremely difficult. But drone warfare has changed dramatically. Ukraine can now produce comparatively inexpensive unmanned aircraft capable of traveling hundreds of kilometers. If one drone is intercepted, another can follow. If radar is destroyed, a temporary corridor appears. If electronic warfare equipment is damaged, navigation becomes easier. If electricity disappears, some defensive systems become less reliable. Ukraine's commander Robert Brovdy claims his forces have destroyed more than 300 Russian air defense-related assets in recent months, including radar, surface-to-air systems, and electronic warfare equipment. That number has not been independently confirmed, but his description of the strategy is more important than the number. First, weaken the defensive shield, then exploit the opening, then attack the infrastructure behind it, then return when Russia begins repairing what was damaged. That creates a completely different kind of battlefield. Instead of one decisive attack, Russia faces repeated small crises. One substation, one radar, one bridge, one tanker, one railway section, one fuel depot, one communications site, then another, and another. Repair crews can restore infrastructure, but repairing a target does not guarantee that target survives the following night. This is why the word paralyzed in the title needs to be understood correctly. Crimea is not literally frozen. Cars still move. Russian forces remain deployed. Russian institutions continue operating. Some tourists are still visiting. Supplies are still entering. Russia still controls the peninsula. But military paralysis does not always mean absolutely nothing moves. Sometimes it means an army loses freedom of movement. It means commanders cannot assume electricity will remain available. It means fuel deliveries require greater protection. It means routes previously considered dependable become unpredictable. It means radar sites have to be repositioned. It means air defense missiles and electronic warfare systems must protect electrical infrastructure instead of protecting something else. And most importantly, it forces Moscow to spend more resources simply maintaining what it already controls. That may be Ukraine's real objective. Because Crimea's greatest value to Russia was never simply its beaches or symbolic meaning. Its greatest value was geographical. Look at the map. Crimea projects deep into the Black Sea. Sevastopol historically supported Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Airfields on the peninsula can support operations across southern Ukraine. Supply facilities can assist Russian forces fighting north of Crimea. Radar systems provide surveillance. Missile systems can threaten Ukrainian territory. For years, Russia transformed Crimea into what was effectively a giant military platform. Ukraine now appears determined to reverse that transformation, not necessarily by storming the peninsula with thousands of soldiers, but by dismantling the systems that allow the platform to operate efficiently. Brovdy told AP that the goal is to create conditions in which military capabilities can no longer remain effectively based there. He described the current campaign as only the beginning. That statement matters because Ukraine's biggest limitation remains obvious. Kiev currently does not possess an easy military path to reconquering Crimea through a conventional ground offensive. A large assault across heavily defended approaches would be enormously difficult and costly. An amphibious invasion would face even greater dangers, so Ukraine is pursuing something different. Isolation. If you cannot immediately capture the fortress, weaken the roads feeding it. If you cannot storm every military base, attack the power supporting it. If you cannot destroy every aircraft, strike the radar protecting the airfield. If you cannot blockade every port with warships, use drones against vessels and logistics infrastructure. If you cannot physically occupy the territory today, reduce its usefulness to the enemy tomorrow. That is what makes this campaign strategically fascinating. Ukraine is trying to turn geography against Russia. But the consequences are not limited to military bases. Ordinary people are paying a price as well. The Guardian reported in July that more than 70% of Crimea's roughly 2.5 million residents had experienced some form of electricity outage. Residents described searching for fuel, struggling with running water, and relying on local chats to discover where electricity or gasoline might still be available. Restaurants and tourism businesses reported falling demand and difficulty obtaining supplies. That raises one of the most uncomfortable questions in this entire campaign. Where does military infrastructure end and civilian infrastructure begin? An electrical substation can supply a radar base, but it also supplies apartment buildings. A railway can transport military equipment, but it also transports civilians. Fuel can power an army truck. It can also power an ambulance. Ukraine argues that Crimea's infrastructure is deeply integrated with Russia's military occupation. Russia accuses Ukraine of destabilizing civilian life. And civilians caught between those strategies experience the consequences regardless of which military objective caused them. This is why any serious analysis has to resist turning hardship into entertainment. Blackouts are not simply impressive lines on a military map. Behind every outage are refrigerators, medical equipment, elevators, water pumps, communications networks, and families trying to continue normal life. Russia itself has spent years attacking Ukraine's energy infrastructure, causing massive civilian disruption across Ukrainian cities. Now, some of the infrastructure supporting Russia's occupation of Crimea is experiencing the logic of infrastructure warfare from the opposite direction. And politically, that presents Putin with a problem. Crimea was supposed to represent stability. After Russia annexed the peninsula in 2014, the Kremlin presented the territory as a permanent achievement. The message was essentially this: Crimea is ours. Crimea is secure. Crimea is prosperous. Crimea is protected. Crimea will never return to Ukraine. For years, that message was easier to maintain because the battlefield felt distant. Then Ukraine began striking military airfields, then naval facilities, then Russian ships, then radar, then oil infrastructure, then bridges, then electrical systems, and suddenly the battlefield was no longer distant. For residents, the war could arrive through a dark apartment building, an empty fuel station, or a phone that had lost its network. This threatens something extremely important to authoritarian systems: the appearance of control. Governments can survive shortages. Governments can survive infrastructure damage. Governments can even survive military embarrassment. What becomes dangerous is when the population begins questioning whether the state can still deliver the security it promised. The Kremlin has tried to project reassurance. Putin described the difficulties as temporary and ordered subsidies aimed at addressing fuel costs and shortages. Russian-installed authorities have continued repairing infrastructure and adapting emergency services. And Moscow still possesses enormous resources. That is why predictions of Crimea's imminent collapse should be treated cautiously. Russia can move generators, it can reroute supplies, it can repair substations, it can deploy additional air defenses, it can restrict civilian fuel consumption, it can prioritize military logistics, it can change shipping routes. And above all, Russia can absorb enormous costs when the Kremlin considers a territory strategically vital. That means Ukraine has not won Crimea. Far from it. Russian forces remain deeply entrenched. The peninsula remains under Moscow's control. The Kerch connection and land routes have not disappeared. The Black Sea Fleet, although pressured and redistributed, has not ceased to exist. And no blackout automatically translates into territorial liberation. But Ukraine may not need immediate liberation for the campaign to produce strategic results. Imagine Russia has 10 air defense systems. Previously, 8 could protect military installations while 2 guarded infrastructure. Now repeated drone attacks force 5 to protect substations, bridges, and logistics hubs. Ukraine has changed the equation without destroying all 10 systems. Imagine Russia previously needed 100 trucks to deliver a certain quantity of supplies. Now damaged routes, detours, and fuel shortages mean it needs 130. Again, Ukraine has changed the equation. Imagine a military facility previously relied on grid electricity. Now it runs on generators. Those generators require diesel. The diesel requires tankers. The tankers require roads. The roads require protection. One successful electrical strike has created several new logistical burdens. Multiply that process across an entire peninsula. That is attrition. Not attrition measured only in dead soldiers or destroyed tanks. Attrition measured in maintenance hours, fuel consumption, replacement transformers, air defense missiles, truck mileage, engineering crews, security deployments, lost tourism revenue, delayed cargo, and political credibility. This is why Crimea may now be becoming something Putin never intended it to become: a resource sink. The original logic of annexation was that Crimea strengthened Russia. It expanded Moscow's position in the Black Sea. It gave Putin enormous domestic political prestige. It provided military infrastructure close to southern Ukraine. But if Ukraine can continuously force Russia to defend hundreds of vulnerable nodes, Crimea begins consuming more military power simply to remain operational. And the story may still be in its early stages. On August 10, Bravdi told the Associated Press that Ukraine's current operations represent the beginning of an open-ended campaign. Perhaps the most remarkable part of his interview was his claim that his forces are operating with only about 14% of the capacity they believe they need for the Crimea operation. Whether Ukraine can obtain the funding and equipment necessary to expand that campaign remains uncertain. But if it does, the pressure could intensify significantly. Russia will adapt too. Electronic warfare will improve. More jamming systems may appear. Air defenses will move. Critical facilities will be hardened. Decoys will multiply. Repair crews will become faster. Important infrastructure may receive additional protection. This will become a contest between Ukraine's ability to identify and strike vulnerable nodes and Russia's ability to repair, defend, and reroute faster than Ukraine can attack. And that is why the next phase could matter more than the first. Ukraine does not need Crimea to go completely dark every night. It needs uncertainty. Russia needs predictability. It needs commanders to know that fuel will arrive, that trains will run, that radar will work, that electricity will remain available, that ships can enter, that trucks can cross, that repairs will survive. Ukraine's campaign attacks that predictability. And once reliability disappears, military planning becomes harder even when the underlying infrastructure technically still exists. That brings us back to Putin's crown jewel. 12 years ago, Crimea represented certainty. Today, it represents a question. How much will Russia have to spend to keep it functioning? How much infrastructure must Moscow defend? How much fuel can be diverted? How many air defense systems can be moved away from other fronts? How many times can the same installations be repaired? And how much disruption can residents absorb before the Kremlin's promise of permanent security begins to sound increasingly hollow? Crimea is not falling today. But the idea of Crimea as an untouchable Russian fortress may already have fallen. Ukraine has demonstrated something that would have sounded almost impossible earlier in the war. It can repeatedly reach deep inside one of Russia's most strategically valuable occupied territories. It can attack logistics. It can pressure electrical infrastructure. It can threaten fuel supplies. It can force new emergency measures. And according to the commander responsible for much of Ukraine's drone campaign, the operation is nowhere near finished. So when you look at Crimea now, don't just watch the explosions. Watch the electricity. Watch the tankers. Watch the railway lines. Watch the bridges. Watch where Russia moves its air defenses. Watch how many resources Moscow must divert simply to restore yesterday's damage before tomorrow night's drones arrive. Because wars are not always decided when one army dramatically storms a fortress. Sometimes a fortress loses its value long before it loses its flag. And that may be the real danger facing Vladimir Putin in Crimea. He can still claim the peninsula. He can still station soldiers there. He can still show it on Russian maps. But every blackout, every disrupted fuel shipment, every damaged railway, and every relocated air defense battery raises the same uncomfortable question. Can Russia still use Crimea the way it once could? If the answer continues moving toward no, then Ukraine does not need to physically switch Crimea off forever. It only needs to keep Russia reaching for the switch. Again, and again, and again. Until Putin's crown jewel stops functioning like a fortress and starts functioning like a liability. What happens next could determine far more than the fate of the peninsula. Because if Ukraine succeeds in making Crimea increasingly difficult to defend and supply, the consequences could eventually reach the negotiating table itself. For 12 years, Moscow treated Crimea as the one issue that could never be reopened. Ukraine is now attempting to reopen it without moving a single negotiating chair. Not with speeches, not with diplomatic statements, but with drones, disrupted logistics, and the slow erosion of the assumption that Russia's control is irreversible. Crimea remains occupied. Russia remains powerful. The outcome is far from decided, But the peninsula that once symbolized Putin's greatest geopolitical triumph is now becoming one of the clearest demonstrations of how dramatically this war has changed. And if this truly is only phase 1, the most important question isn't whether Crimea is dark tonight. It's what will still be functioning there when phase 2 begins.